Hey there! Welcome back to another evening of boring history for sleep. Tonight, we're traveling to a different continent and era. We'll be exploring life in Africa during the 1900s elapse, a time of colonial rule, changing landscapes, and challenging conditions. Forget the romanticized safari adventures you've seen in films. The truth is, you probably wouldn't last a single day in this environment. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I create here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining our sleepy history community from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background noise. And let's drift into tonight's historical journey together as we explore why daily life in early 19th century Africa was so different from what most of us experience today. So, you've decided to wake up in colonial Africa, circa 1900. Bad choice. The sun isn't even up yet, but you already feel like you're being slowly roasted inside an oven made of mosquito bites and regret. Your eyes crack open to absolute darkness. No, not the comfortable darkness of your blackout curtains and ambient nightlight. This is the kind of darkness that swallows souls and harbors things with too many legs. The air around you feels like someone threw a hot, wet blanket over your face. 85% humidity before sunrise will do that. Your nostrils fill with the pungent bouquet of mildew, sweat-soaked bedding, and whatever small creatures decided to die in your walls this week. That crunching sound? That's just your straw mattress, announcing that its resident insects are also starting their day. You stretch and your joints sound like a xylophone being played by an enthusiastic toddler with a hammer. Congratulations! At the ripe age of 29, you're practically ancient by 1900's colonial standards. The average European in Africa could expect to live a whopping 5-7 years after arrival before succumbing to disease, heat exhaustion, or the crushing realization that the adventure they signed up for was actually just slow, sweaty suicide. Medical officer reports from British Colonial Service 1905 showed 30-40% mortality rates for newcomers within their first 3 years. The darkness presses in as you fumble for your matches. No electricity here, friend. No light switches, no flush toilets, no air conditioning, no social media to distract you from the existential dread of being in a place where approximately 800 different species would consider your soft body a delicacy. The match flares, momentarily blinding you and sending 100 tiny shadows scuttling under your furniture. Those would be the cockroaches, the big ones, the kind that don't so much flee from light as grudgingly concede territory until you go back to sleep. Your feet hit the floor, which is mercifully solid, if you're a colonial administrator or missionary with any standing. If not, you might be feeling dirt between your toes right about now. Your mosquito netting, that gossamer barrier between you and cerebral malaria, has several small holes in it. You make a mental note to patch them, knowing full well that even a single night with a tear in your netting is essentially playing Russian roulette with your brain. Colonial medical records from 1902 indicate that up to 80% of Europeans in West Africa contracted malaria annually, with mortality rates hovering around 25% per infection without proper treatment. You stand, and your nightclothes peel away from your body like a second, sweatier skin. Sleep wasn't sleep so much as a damp fever dream punctuated by mysterious sounds from the darkness beyond your windows. Was that a hyena? A leopard? Angry locals planning to rid themselves of another colonial parasite? The mind wanders in uncomfortable directions at 5 a.m. in a place where you fundamentally do not belong. And that's just the first 30 seconds of consciousness. Still think you'd make it as a colonial agent? Hope you didn't plan on showering this morning, or drinking clean water, or surviving until lunch. Congratulations on surviving the first 5 minutes of your day in 1900's colonial Africa. Now comes your morning routine, which is less self-care and more desperate attempt at not dying before breakfast. The water in your washing basin, left there by your local servant last night, is now home to a thriving ecosystem of mosquito larvae. Look at them wiggle! Each one a potential vector for yellow fever, which liquefies your internal organs while turning your skin the color of a banana. Fun! You could dump it out, but fresh water is precious. Colonial outposts often had to haul water from rivers or wells up to a mile away, and that's assuming the dry season hasn't made water sources scarce. Colonial Administrative Records, East Africa Protectorate, 1903. So instead, you fish out the visible larvae with your fingers and proceed to wash your face with what remains, a lukewarm soup of invisible bacteria and parasite eggs. Your toothbrush is made from boar bristles or, if you're really roughing it, a chewed stick from a local tree. Your toothpaste? Bicarbonate of soda, if you're lucky. More likely, you're using salt or just plain water. Your breath will smell like something crawled into your mouth and decomposed regardless, because dental hygiene in 1900 was basically wait until it hurts, then pull it out. The closest qualified dentist might be several hundred miles away, so that abscessed molar you're developing will be a fun companion for the next few months. Time to use the toilet. Except there is no toilet. There's a chamber pot under your bed for nighttime emergencies, and it needs emptying. The smell hits you like a physical assault as you pull it out. The hot climate has been working overtime on yesterday's contributions. If you're in a settlement with any infrastructure, there might be a communal outhouse. If not, it's a hole in the ground behind your dwelling, shared with every insect in a 12-mile radius. Dysentery killed more European colonials than any other disease besides malaria, with outbreaks in military garrisons reaching 50% infection rates during rainy seasons. British Army Medical Corps statistics, West African Frontier Force, 1,899,904. Speaking of dysentery, let's talk about your toilet paper options. There aren't any. Depending on your location, you might use leaves. Careful of the ones that cause rashes. A communal sponge on a stick. Yes, communal. The Romans used them. Colonial outposts continued the tradition. Or your left hand followed by a rinse in potentially contaminated water. Still feeling superior to the savages you came to civilize? Now for the true horror of your morning routine. Getting dressed. Your clothing options are limited and terrible. If you're following European standards of the day, men are expected to wear wool suits complete with waistcoats and high collars. Women? Full-length dresses with multiple layers, possibly including a corset. In 100-degree heat, with 90% humidity. The British Colonial Office didn't officially relax dress codes until 1921, meaning that in 1900, you're still sweating through formal European attire as if fashion were more important than not dying of heat stroke. Your outfit is already growing mold in places you can't see, harboring lice eggs, and generally serving as an elaborate torture device disguised as proper colonial attire. Oh, and those shoes you're putting on? They might contain a scorpion, or a centipede, or a spider that will turn your foot into something resembling a rotting pumpkin. Always shake out your footwear before inserting extremities. It's rule number 1 of colonial survival. Your morning grooming takes approximately 10 times longer than it would in the 21st century, uses 4 times the water, and leaves you feeling roughly 1/3 as clean. The natives watching you go through this Byzantine routine of pseudo-hygiene are quietly wondering how such a backward people ever managed to conquer anything. And you haven't even had breakfast yet. Hope you like weevils in your porridge and malaria with your morning tea. Ah, breakfast in colonial Africa. That magical time of day when you discover new and exciting ways that food can disappoint, disgust, and potentially disable you. Take a seat at your wobbly table, assuming the termites haven't restructured it overnight into modern art. The first assault on your senses comes from your coffee, which isn't so much coffee as it is a lukewarm slurry of grounds, local water, and whatever microscopic organisms have decided to throw a pool party in your cup. The coffee beans themselves have endured a 3-month ocean voyage from somewhere civilized, followed by weeks of being transported through dust, heat, and the occasional torrential downpour. They taste like disappointment with notes of cardboard and regret. Colonial import records from the German East Africa Company show that by the time most food supplies reached interior stations, up to 40% had spoiled or been contaminated. Deutsche Kolonialgesellschaft Archive 1898到1904. Your bread, if you can call it that, has the consistency of a small brick and approximately the same flavor profile. It was baked yesterday, maybe the day before, using flour that's been locked in an epic battle with weevils since it left Europe months ago. The weevils are winning. You'll find their tiny corpses providing unexpected protein with every bite. Knock the bread against the table and listen to that satisfying thunk. Still safer than eating the local food, though, right? That's what your colonial superiors keep telling you. Despite the fact that dysentery rates among Europeans who insisted on European diets were nearly double those who adapted to local cuisine, medical reports from French Colonial Health Service, 1,901. Let's not forget your eggs, which come from scrawny local chickens and have been sitting in the sweltering heat long enough to make their freshness questionable at best. You crack one open and something that's not quite liquid, not quite solid slithers onto your plate. Is that a half-formed chick? Maybe. Surprise protein. Colonial nutritional deficiencies were so common that scurvy appeared in military garrisons despite being easily preventable, simply because Europeans refused to eat vitamin-rich local fruits and vegetables. British Colonial Medical Reports, Gold Coast, 1,904. The jam for your brick bread has fermented in its jar, giving it a slight alcoholic kick at 7 a.m. The butter has turned a fascinating shade of yellow-green that doesn't exist in nature. But you eat it anyway, because the alternative is acknowledging that you've made a terrible life choice coming here. As you choke down this parade of culinary abominations, your local house staff watch with a mixture of pity and confusion. The same people you consider uncivilized are enjoying fresh local fruits, grains prepared that morning, and protein that wasn't dead before it left Europe. They're also not dying of scurvy, beriberi, and other exciting nutritional deficiencies that plague colonial Europeans too stubborn to adapt their diets. Your breakfast is interrupted by the daily parade of insects across your table. Ants form perfect military formations to extract crumbs from your plate while you're still using it. A cockroach the size of your thumb scuttles past your water glass, pausing briefly as if to say, "I'll be back for you later." You've learned not to scream at the wildlife anymore. It only wastes energy you'll need for surviving until lunch. You wash down your sad meal with boiled water that tastes faintly of the metal canteen it was stored in, mixed with whatever chemicals were used to purify it. If you're particularly wealthy or important, you might have access to imported soda water, which at least masks the taste of potential cholera with bubbles and makes dying of dehydration slightly more festive. Breakfast complete, you've successfully navigated the first major health gamble of your day. Your stomach gurgles ominously. Is it dysentery o'clock already? No. That's just your body processing what you've convinced it was food. The day has barely begun, and already you're exhausted, sweating through your ridiculous European clothing, and questioning every decision that led you to this god-forsaken place. And now, with crumbs of weevil bread still stuck in your teeth, it's time to venture outside. Hope you've updated your will. Stepping outside your dwelling in 1900s colonial Africa is less starting your workday and more entering an environment actively hostile to your continued existence. The good news is, you've survived. Breakfast. The bad news is absolutely everything else. The heat hits you like a physical blow to the chest. It's only 8:30 a.m. and already pushing 95 degrees. By noon, temperatures in many regions regularly exceeded 110°F during dry seasons, with humidity levels making it feel even more oppressive. Meteorological records, British East Africa, 1897到1905. Your heavy European clothing immediately activates its primary function, creating a personal sauna that ensures no part of your body will remain dry until winter, which doesn't actually exist here. Your first steps outside disturb a cloud of mosquitoes that have been patiently waiting for the breakfast buffet, that's you, to emerge. They descend in a humming swarm, targeting any exposed skin with the precision of tiny, flying vampires. Each bite isn't just itchy, it's a lottery ticket for malaria, yellow fever, dengue, or any of the other dozen mosquito-borne diseases that consider your soft European body an all-you-can-eat pathogen transmission facility. The path to your workplace, whether that's a colonial administrative office, missionary post, or trading station, is less a road and more a suggestion of where humans have previously suffered while walking. During dry season, each step kicks up dust containing fecal matter, parasites, and bacteria that immediately coat your sweaty skin and find their way into your respiratory system. During rainy season, the same path transforms into a boot-sucking mudslick teeming with everything that was previously in the dust, now activated and mobile in water. Colonial records from Uganda show that during particularly wet seasons, administrators sometimes had to be carried to work by local porters because the mud made roads completely impassable. Uganda Protectorate Administrative Dispatches 1902. Your walk to work features a soundtrack of buzzing, chirping, hissing, and the occasional distant roar that reminds you that humans are, in fact, made of meat. The tsetse fly, a particular African specialty, delivers bites that feel like someone's stabbing you with a hot needle. They're not just painful, they're also the primary vector for trypanosomiasis, or sleeping sickness, which causes its victims to waste away while experiencing confusion, personality changes, and ultimately a coma before death. By 1906, sleeping sickness had killed over 250 people in the Uganda Protectorate alone. If you're important enough to have transportation, your options aren't much better. Horses, they die quickly in tsetse fly regions. Camels, hope you enjoy the smell and being occasionally spit on by an animal that genuinely hates you. Human porters carrying you in a sedan chair. Nothing says colonial master quite like being physically carried by the people whose land you're occupying. The awkwardness is palpable, especially when they accidentally jostle you over the rough parts of the road. You might have access to an early automobile if you're exceptionally important, but these temperamental machines were basically useless on colonial roads. Colonial administrative reports frequently mentioned vehicles being abandoned after becoming stuck, sometimes for weeks, until the dry season returned. British colonial office records, Northern Nigeria, 1904. As you trudge along, sweating profusely through your inappropriate clothing, locals pass by in garments perfectly adapted to the climate, loose, light fabrics that allow air circulation while providing sun protection. They're not sweating bullets or gasping for breath. They look at you with expressions ranging from amusement to pity as you, the supposedly superior European, struggle to perform the basic function of moving from one place to another without collapsing. The walk itself might be anywhere from a few hundred yards to several miles, each step increasing your risk of heat stroke, insect-borne disease, snakebite, or simply tripping and cutting yourself on something that will introduce fascinating tropical infections into your bloodstream. Colonial medical records show that even minor cuts and abrasions frequently led to serious infections, requiring amputation in the pre-antibiotic era. Medical officer reports, British Colonial Hospital, Lagos, 1900到1905. By the time you reach your workplace, you've sweated through every layer of your clothing, accumulated several dozen new insect bites, and depleted whatever reserves of energy your weevil-bred breakfast provided. Your workday hasn't even started, and already you're dehydrated, itchy, and wondering if that headache is the beginning of malaria or just standard heat exhaustion. And the sun isn't even at its peak yet. Only another 10 hours of colonial glory to go before you can return to your mildew-scented bedroom and do it all again tomorrow. Assuming, of course, that you make it through the day alive. Congratulations on arriving at your workplace in colonial Africa. Whether it's a government building, trading post, or missionary station, they all share one quality. They were designed by someone who never set foot in Africa and had apparently never heard of concepts like ventilation or "it's hot in Africa." Your office, if you're lucky enough to have one, is a monument to European architectural arrogance. The building is likely made of stone or brick, materials excellent at absorbing heat during the day and radiating it back at night, creating a structure that is essentially a slow-cooking oven with desks. Colonial architects initially transplanted European designs directly to Africa with minimal adaptations, leading to buildings that were environmental disasters in tropical climates. Architectural records of the British Colonial Office, East Africa Protectorate, 1895-1910. The windows are too small, the ceilings either too low or absurdly high, and any breeze that might offer relief is blocked by thick walls meant to withstand European winters. Your desk, shipped at great expense from Europe, is warping in the humidity. The drawers stick when you try to open them, requiring a violent yanking motion that sends you staggering backward when they suddenly release, usually dumping their contents onto the floor. Your chair, also imported, features upholstery that's rapidly growing its own ecosystem of mold and mildew. Sitting down releases a small cloud of spores that you inhale deeply. Congratulations, your lungs now have roommates. Colonial medical records show respiratory infections were among the top 3 health complaints of administrative personnel, alongside digestive ailments and fevers, annual health reports. French Colonial Administration, West Africa, 1902-1905. Now for your actual work. Hope you enjoy paperwork, because that's approximately 90% of colonial administration. Every transaction, observation, and minor incident requires documentation in triplicate. You're creating a paper trail for an empire, and the empire is nothing if not bureaucratically thorough. One British colonial administrator in Nigeria complained in his private letters that he filled out 347 separate forms over a 6-month period just to requisition basic supplies, personal correspondence. Captain James Willoughby, Northern Nigeria, 1903. Your writing implements include fountain pens that leak constantly in the heat, creating fascinating ink blots on your sweat-soaked documents, and pencils whose lead melts faster than you can sharpen them. Your inkwell is perpetually clogged with the corpses of tiny insects who were attracted to the dark liquid and died there, creating a macabre suspension that you spread across official documents. The paper itself, imported of course, has absorbed so much humidity that it feels damp to the touch. Your handwriting skids and blurs across its surface, making your reports look like they were written during an earthquake on a boat. Attempts to blot the ink just create smudges that transform official colonial correspondence into impressionist art. While struggling with your paperwork, you're constantly interrupted by an impressive array of wildlife. Columns of safari ants march across your desk on mysterious but clearly urgent business. A lizard watches you from the wall, occasionally darting out to snatch one of the dozen flies buzzing around your head, Something unseen scurries across the ceiling rafters, occasionally dropping mysterious debris onto your paperwork. Is it a rat? A snake? A bat? All equally disturbing possibilities. Your local staff, clerks, translators, messengers, move through these conditions with practiced ease while you slowly melt into a puddle of sweat and despair. They complete tasks efficiently despite the heat, insects, and general awfulness, occasionally exchanging glances that clearly communicate their assessment of your colonial incompetence. They correct your linguistic and cultural mistakes when interacting with the local population, saving you from diplomatic incidents on a near-daily basis, all while you believe you're the one civilizing them. The mail arrives. Maybe. If you're on a main route, you might get deliveries every few weeks. If you're stationed in a remote outpost, mail might come once every few months, bringing you newspapers announcing events that happened so long ago they're practically historical documents. One colonial officer in Central Africa reported receiving news of Queen Victoria's death, January 1901, in November of that same year. Having spent 10 months unaware that Edward VII was now on the throne. Personal diary, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Weatherby, British Central Africa Protectorate, 1901. By midday, your productivity has dropped to approximately 0 as the heat reaches its peak. The temperature inside your office rivals a baker's oven, and your brain feels like it's been poached. Any decisions made during these hours will be questionable at best, and possibly trigger international incidents at worst. Colonial administrative records show a marked increase in erroneous judgments and poor decision-making during afternoon hours, particularly during hot seasons. Administrative Review Committee, Gold Coast Colony, 1904. Your work clothes, still formal European attire because standards must be maintained, are now completely saturated with sweat. Your collar has effectively transformed into a personal torture device, and your shoes have created a humid microclimate that's ideal for fungal growth. That itching between your toes? That's athlete's foot taking up permanent residence. And yet, the empire demands paperwork. The reports must flow. The colonial machine must grind on, even as you personally grind to a halt in a puddle of your own perspiration. Just a few more hours until lunch break, assuming you still have an appetite after watching the cockroaches race across your sandwich while it waited in your desk drawer all morning. Welcome to the glamorous world of colonial administration, where the only thing more crushing than the heat is the weight of imperial bureaucracy. It's finally lunchtime in colonial Africa circa 1900. That magical hour when you get to experience new and exciting forms of culinary disappointment while questioning every life choice that led you to this sweltering hellscape. The colonial lunch hour typically stretches to 2 or even 3 hours, not because anyone values your work-life balance, but because attempting to do anything productive during the peak heat of midday is an exercise in futility. Colonial administrative schedules across Africa almost universally included extended midday breaks, with official business often suspended between 12:00 and 3:00 p.m. due to heat that rendered European administrators essentially non-functional. Administrative Guidelines, British East Africa Protectorate, 1902. If you're important enough, you might retreat to a colonial club for your midday meal. These bastions of European civilization dot the African landscape like lily-white pimples on the face of imperialism. Inside, fans operated by local servants move the hot air around while you pretend it's actually cooling you. The decor screams, "We've recreated a slice of London, Paris, Berlin in the middle of Africa," and will absolutely ignore all evidence, suggesting this was a terrible idea. The colonial club menu features sad approximations of European cuisine made with ingredients that have traveled too far and survived too poorly. The meat is of questionable origin and more questionable freshness, disguised under heavy sauces that are themselves culinary war crimes. Food poisoning was so common among colonial administrators that many developed the habit of fasting during working hours to avoid being incapacitated by digestive distress while on duty. Medical reports. German Colonial Health Service, East Africa, 1903 1907. You order a whiskey or gin with your meal because alcohol is serving two crucial functions in colonial life. It temporarily makes your situation seem less dire, and it's safer than the water. Colonial alcohol consumption reached staggering levels, with the average British officer in West Africa consuming nearly a bottle of spirits daily. The Nigerian Colonial Medical Service reported in 1905 that alcoholism was endemic among European staff, with over 40% showing signs of dependency. Your dining companions, fellow colonials all, engage in the time-honored tradition of complaining about everything: the heat, the locals, the insects, the mail service, and especially their superiors. The conversation has all the intellectual depth of a teaspoon and the casual racism of, well, early 20th century colonialism. The same jokes circulate endlessly, growing moldier than the bread. Someone inevitably makes an observation about the locals that demonstrates both breathtaking ignorance and unearned superiority. Everyone nods sagely. If you're not elite enough for club access, you might take your lunch at your quarters or a local eating establishment that caters to Europeans. The food quality decreases proportionally with your status, but the risk of gastrointestinal distress remains admirably consistent across all social strata. As you pick at your unidentifiable meat drowning in gelatinous sauce, you notice the flies. They're everywhere, on your food, on the table, on your drinking glass, possibly in your drink. Shooing them away is a full-time job that would require more hands than you possess. Eventually, you simply accept their presence as unwanted luncheon guests and try not to think about where those tiny fly feet have been before landing on your fork. Diseases transmitted by flies, including typhoid and dysentery, accounted for approximately 30% of European hospitalizations in colonial Africa. Statistical Review, Colonial Medical Services Combined Data, 1898到1905. Your dining experience is further enhanced by the arrival of the afternoon rain, if it's rainy season. Within seconds, the peaceful sound of raindrops escalates to the deafening roar of a downpour hammering on metal roofs. Conversation becomes impossible. The humidity somehow increases, creating an atmosphere reminiscent of a steam room where someone is also cooking overripe meat. If it's dry season instead, you might be treated to a dust storm that coats your meal with a fine layer of grit, adding a satisfying crunch to dishes never intended to crunch. Your teeth grind unpleasantly as you chew, each bite a reminder that nature itself has seasoned your food with particles collected from who knows where. While you struggle through your meal, you can't help but notice the local population eating their midday meals. They're consuming fresh local produce, properly spiced dishes that have been prepared that same day, and they're doing it in shaded, well-ventilated areas while wearing clothing appropriate for the climate. They appear to be, dare you admit it, enjoying their food and not suffering afterward. But no, European superiority must be maintained. Better to eat terrible approximations of European food than adapt to local customs, even if it means chronic indigestion and nutritional deficiencies. After lunch, you face a critical colonial decision: attempt to work through the food coma and afternoon heat, or surrender to the siesta that your body desperately craves. If you choose work, you'll accomplish approximately nothing while feeling miserable. If you choose rest, you'll be judged by your more masochistic colleagues who equate suffering with virtue. Colonial administrative productivity reports consistently showed that afternoon work hours produced roughly one-third the output of morning hours. Efficiency studies, French colonial administration, Senegal, 1904. Your lunch break concludes as it began, with sweat, flies, and the growing suspicion that coming to Africa was the worst decision of your soon-to-be abbreviated life. The afternoon stretches before you like an endless desert of discomfort, and you still have dinner to look forward to. Assuming, of course, that the rumbling in your stomach is just normal digestion and not the opening salvo of dysentery. Welcome back from your questionable lunch break. Hope you enjoyed that culinary journey through regret and potential food poisoning. Now it's time for your afternoon colonial duties. That magical period when the heat, digestive distress, and cultural incompetence combine to create a perfect storm of imperial inefficiency. The afternoon heat in colonial Africa isn't just hot, it's a physical entity that wraps around you like a weighted blanket made of lava. Temperatures regularly soared above 105 due-4F, 40 due-4C, in the shade during peak afternoon hours across much of colonial Africa, with humidity levels making it feel significantly worse. Meteorological records: German East Africa 1,905. Your office, having spent all morning absorbing solar radiation, is now essentially a brick oven where paperwork goes to die. If you're an administrator, your afternoon tasks might include meeting with local leaders, which is a masterclass in miscommunication and cultural obliviousness. Despite having translators, you'll miss roughly 70% of the cultural context and nuance in any conversation. Colonial administrators frequently recorded in their journals frustration at negotiations that seemed to go nowhere, completely missing that their European directness and time obsession were considered deeply offensive in many African cultures. Administrative Training Manual Revisions, British Colonial Service, 1904. You speak too loudly, gesticulate too much, and constantly check your pocket watch. A clear sign to locals that you value arbitrary time measurements over actual human connection. Your attempts at understanding the natives are undercut by your complete unwillingness to question your core assumptions about superiority, progress, and civilization. Colonial training manuals from this period devoted approximately 80% of their content to administrative procedures and only 20% to cultural understanding, most of which was wildly inaccurate. Colonial Service Preparation Guidelines, British Foreign Office, 1901. If you're a missionary, your afternoon might include attempting to convert locals who are politely tolerating your presence while wondering why your God demands such impractical clothing and seems so obsessed with making people feel guilty about perfectly normal human activities. Your conversion rates are abysmal, approximately 3–5% in most regions, but you'll report much higher numbers back home to keep the funding flowing. Missionary Society Annual Reports versus Colonial Census. Data: 1,900, 1,910. For those engaged in commercial enterprises, the afternoon involves haggling with local traders who run circles around you, managing workers who deliberately misunderstand your instructions when they conflict with centuries of local knowledge, and writing reports that grossly overestimate the colony's economic potential to keep investors happy. European trading companies in Africa had failure rates exceeding 60% in their first 5 years of operation, largely due to misunderstanding local conditions, commercial registry records. British and German colonial territories, 1,895, 1,905. No matter your occupation, your afternoon productivity approaches absolute zero as the heat intensifies. Your brain feels poached, your thoughts moving through molasses. You make errors in calculation, judgment, and basic human interaction that would be embarrassing in any other context, but are just Tuesday in the colonies. Colonial medical officers recognized a condition they informally called afternoon fever. Not an actual fever, but a state of mental sluggishness and irritability that affected nearly all Europeans during peak heat hours. Medical officer reports, French Equatorial Africa, 1,903. The locals, meanwhile, have sensibly adapted their work patterns to the climate, doing more intense labor in the cooler morning and evening hours and taking appropriate rest during peak heat. You, however, cling desperately to European work schedules, because discipline and civilization apparently mean ignoring basic environmental realities. Your afternoon is punctuated by the constant need for water, which presents its own dilemma. The local water supply, despite your best filtration efforts, remains a microbial wonderland of potential diseases. Boiled water tastes flat and unpalatable. Alcohol seems increasingly tempting as both disinfectant and mental escape. Many colonial administrators developed serious alcohol dependency, with medical reports from the period indicating that cirrhosis and alcohol-related illnesses accounted for nearly 15% of European deaths in colonial service. Mortality reports. Combined colonial medical records, 1,910. As if the heat weren't enough, the wildlife continues its campaign of harassment. The afternoon brings out new insect species, seemingly designed specifically to torment Europeans. Biting flies target any exposed skin with surgical precision. Something is always buzzing near your ear, just out of swatting range. Mysterious rashes develop in places you can't politely scratch in public. Colonial medical reports described over 40 distinct types of dermatological conditions common among Europeans, most caused by insects or parasites. Tropical Medicine Journal, London School of Hygiene, 1902. By late afternoon, your clothing has cycled through multiple rounds of soaking with sweat and partial drying, leaving it stiff with salt deposits in some places and clinging wetly in others. The smell emanating from your person would be considered a biological weapon in more civilized contexts. You fantasize about ice, snow, rain, anything cold and wet that isn't your own perspiration. And through it all, you maintain the facade of European superiority while being comprehensively outperformed in almost every practical aspect of existence by the local population you're supposedly civilizing. They navigate the environment with ease while you blunder through it like a toddler having a tantrum. They remain healthy eating local foods while you sicken on imported ones. They communicate effectively across linguistic barriers while you remain persistently, proudly monolingual. As the sun finally begins its descent, you can almost feel a wave of collective relief washing across the colony. You've survived another tropical afternoon without completely embarrassing the empire or dying of heat stroke. Time to pack up your damp paperwork and make the sweaty trek back to your quarters, where a whole new set of colonial discomforts awaits you. And if you're thinking, surely the evening brings relief from the heat, then you clearly haven't been paying attention to how this whole colonial experience works. The fun is just beginning. Congratulations! You've survived your workday in 1900s colonial Africa. The setting sun signals the end of your official duties and the beginning of evening discomforts that will carry you all the way to your restless sleep. What exciting new miseries await you on your journey home? Let's find out. As you leave your workplace, you're greeted by the evening shift of biting insects, fresh and hungry after resting during the afternoon heat. The mosquitoes that troubled your morning commute have returned with reinforcements, creating a buzzing cloud that follows you like a personal entourage of tiny vampires. Mosquito species in Africa evolved to feed at different times of day, ensuring a 24-hour buffet experience with you as the main course. Entomological Studies, Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, 1901到1904. The walk home features the same treacherous path as this morning, but with an exciting new twist: diminishing visibility. Colonial settlements were notoriously poorly lit, with street lighting either non-existent or limited to a few main thoroughfares near administrative buildings. Most Europeans carried lanterns after sunset, creating perfect targets for every flying insect within a half-mile radius. Municipal development reports, British East African settlements 1899到1905. The rapidly falling darkness brings new concerns beyond mere insects. Snakes, having spent the day avoiding the heat, become more active in the evening hours. That twig on the path might be a black mamba, whose venom can kill within hours. Colonial medical records from Nyasaland, now Malawi, documented that snake bites accounted for approximately 5% of European emergency medical treatments, with a mortality rate approaching 30% despite treatment. Hospital records, British Central Africa Protectorate, 1,902 1,907. If you're stationed in a rural outpost, your evening commute might include larger wildlife concerns. Leopards regularly hunted at dawn and dusk near human settlements, and while they generally avoided full-grown humans, attacks weren't unheard of. Colonial police reports documented 17 leopard attacks on Europeans between 1898 and 1905 across British East Africa, with 6 fatalities. Security bulletins, East Africa Protectorate Police Force, 1898到1905. Your arrival home brings no immediate relief. Your dwelling, which has been sealed up all day to prevent theft because colonial paranoia is always justified, has effectively transformed into a convection oven. Opening the windows invites the insect population to dinner. Again, you're the meal. While leaving them closed means slowly poaching in your own juices. It's a classic colonial conundrum with no good solution. Evening hygiene presents another depressing choice. Remain coated in the day's accumulated sweat, dust, and dead insects, or attempt to bathe using water of questionable provenance heated over a fire or stove in an already sweltering environment. Colonial homes rarely had proper bathrooms by modern standards. A tin tub and pitcher of water was considered luxurious in many outposts. Architectural plans, colonial housing department, German East Africa, 1898到1902. If you opt for cleanliness, your bathwater quickly transforms into a tepid soup of your own filth. Soap, if you have it, is likely homemade from animal fat and lye, leaving your skin feeling simultaneously greasy and dried out. Towels, perpetually damp in the humid environment, smell faintly of mildew no matter how recently they've been washed. Skin infections were so common among colonial Europeans that they were considered an unavoidable aspect of service, with fungal conditions affecting over 70% of personnel during their tenure. Medical survey, combined colonial health services, 1,904. Now clean-ish and changed into slightly less damp clothing, you might attempt some recreation before dinner. Reading by lamplight attracts every flying insect within visual range of your window. Writing letters home inevitably involves descriptions of hardship that you'll later tone down to avoid worrying your family or admitting you've made a terrible life choice. Board games or cards with fellow colonials offer brief distraction, but inevitably devolve into the same circular conversations about home, promotions, health complaints, and thinly veiled racism. Alcohol becomes increasingly central to colonial evening life, less a social lubricant and more a medicinal attempt to numb yourself to your surroundings. Colonial import records show that per capita alcohol consumption among Europeans in Africa was approximately triple that of their counterparts at home. Trade statistics, various colonial administrations, 1,900, 1,910, the ritual of sundowners, drinks at sunset, became almost religious in its observance, marking the transition from working hours to evening misery. Dinner follows the same culinary trajectory as your other meals. Disappointing approximations of European dishes made with ingredients that have traveled too far, stored too poorly, and prepared by staff who have never tasted the original dishes they're attempting to recreate. Your digestive system, already in open rebellion from breakfast and lunch, receives this final insult with appropriate gastric commentary. The evening heat lingers like an unwelcome houseguest. Temperatures might drop from the daytime inferno to merely uncomfortably warm, but the humidity ensures you continue to sweat through the night. Even the most elite colonial residences struggled with heat management. Governors' mansions in British colonies frequently recorded indoor evening temperatures exceeding 90°F, 32°C, despite architectural attempts at ventilation. Colonial Governor's Residence reports, Gold Coast Colony, 1901. As darkness fully descends, the sounds of Africa intensify. Insects create a deafening chorus outside your windows. Unknown creatures scurry across your roof. Something that might be a bat, or might be something worse, flutters past your head when you step onto your veranda. The darkness feels alive and vaguely hostile, a sentiment captured repeatedly in colonial diaries and correspondence, where the phrase, "the darkness here feels different," appears with remarkable consistency. Collected letters of colonial administrators, various archives, 1895, 1910. The night brings psychological challenges as well. Isolation from familiar surroundings, cultural alienation, and the constant low-grade stress of environmental threats create a perfect storm for mental health deterioration. Reports of tropical neurasthenia, a period diagnosis for anxiety, depression, and psychosomatic symptoms, appeared in up to 25% of medical evaluations of colonial personnel. Psychiatric assessment records, Colonial Medical Services, 1907. Your evening concludes with preparations for sleep, checking your bed for unwanted wildlife, arranging your mosquito netting with ritualistic care, perhaps taking quinine as a prophylactic against malaria despite its unpleasant side effects. Colonial medical officers recommended daily quinine doses between 5–10 grains, roughly 300–600 milligrams, which frequently cause tinnitus, nausea, and visual disturbances. Malaria Prevention Guidelines, British Colonial Medical Service, 1900. As you lie sweating in your bed, listening to the cacophony of nocturnal Africa and scratching at your constellation of insect bites, sleep seems like a distant possibility rather than an imminent reality. But don't worry, even if you do manage to fall asleep, the nightmares about tropical diseases, administrative failures, and home leave being months or years away will ensure your rest is anything but restful. And tomorrow, you get to do it all again. Assuming, of course, that you survive the night. So you've somehow managed to lower your sweating body onto your damp bed, arranged your mosquito netting with the care of a bomb disposal expert, and are now attempting the impossible feat of falling asleep in colonial Africa circa 1900. Good luck with that. The first challenge, your bed itself. European-style beds were imported at great expense, only to rapidly deteriorate in the tropical climate. Your mattress, if you can call it that, might be stuffed with horsehair, cotton, or if you're particularly unfortunate, local grasses and fibers that harbor their own miniature ecosystems. Whatever the filling, it's lumpy, partially decomposed from humidity, and home to an array of small creatures that consider your unconscious body just another warm landscape to explore. Colonial requisition records show that mattresses needed replacement every 18–24 months, compared to the 8–10-year lifespan typical in Europe. Quartermaster supply records, British colonial Africa 1898 1906. The sheets beneath you, assuming you're masochistic enough to use them in this heat, are damp before you even lie down. Cotton sheets in the tropics absorbed atmospheric moisture to such an extent that medical officers recommended airing bedding daily to prevent mold growth. Even with this precaution, sheets would commonly develop patches of mildew within weeks, Hygiene Guidelines, German Colonial Medical Service, 1904. Your pillow, that final bastion of comfort, smells faintly of mildew no matter how recently it's been washed. It's also likely home to dust mites that are having an all-you-can-eat buffet on your dead skin cells. Sweet dreams! Now that you're horizontally uncomfortable, let's discuss the symphony of nocturnal Africa that serves as your sleep soundtrack. The insect chorus reaches deafening levels after dark. Cicadas, crickets, and countless unidentified species create a wall of sound that makes earplugs useless. Colonial diaries frequently mention the insect noise as one of the most difficult aspects of adjustment, with one British administrator in Uganda writing that the ceaseless drone has driven more than one man to the edge of sanity. Personal correspondence, Edmund Hallowell, Uganda Protectorate, 1902. Beyond the insects, the night is punctuated by unfamiliar animal calls, some distant, some disturbingly close. That scream that sounds almost human? Probably a bush baby or tree hyrax, but your brain will absolutely interpret it as someone being murdered outside your window. The deep, rumbling growl could be a leopard passing by, contemplating whether you might make a satisfying midnight snack. The rustling in your roof thatch? Rats, snakes, bats, or some unholy combination of all three. Inside your room, you're treated to the distinct sound of things scuttling across your floor and walls. Colonial housing rarely had proper foundations or sealed walls, allowing an impressive variety of creatures free access to your living space. Scorpions were particularly fond of warm, dark spaces, like shoes left on the floor or the folds of clothing draped over chairs. Hospital records from British East Africa documented an average of 3-4 scorpion sting cases per month among European residents, with most occurrences happening at night. Medical treatment records, Nairobi Hospital, 1,903, 1,907. Sleep, when it finally comes, is its own special form of torture. The heat ensures you never reach truly restful, deep sleep, instead drifting in a humid limbo of half-consciousness. Your dreams are vivid, disturbing, and often fever-tinted, a common side effect of the quinine you're taking to prevent malaria. Colonial medical professionals noted that long-term quinine use frequently caused nightmares, hallucinations, and disorientation, particularly during sleep. Pharmaceutical effect study, Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, 1905. Speaking of malaria, that's assuming your prophylactic regimen is working at all. Many Europeans in Africa contracted malaria despite preventative measures, with the disease recurring every few weeks or months for years. The fever cycles of malaria often began at night, meaning you might drift off relatively comfortable only to wake hours later in a pool of sweat, shivering uncontrollably and hallucinating that your chamber pot is giving you financial advice. Colonial medical records show that in some regions, up to 90% of European residents experienced at least one bout of malaria during their service. Medical statistics, combined colonial health services, 1900到1910. Your fitful sleep is interrupted by the need to urinate, an unpleasant necessity given the volume of liquids you've consumed to prevent dehydration. Now you face a classic colonial dilemma: brave the dark room to find your chamber pot, possibly stepping on something venomous in the process, or risk a journey to the outhouse, which involves leaving your mosquito netting and exposing yourself to the full fury of the nocturnal insect population. Colonial housing plans rarely included indoor toilet facilities. Even government residences typically featured outhouses at a sanitary distance from the main structure. Architectural plans, Colonial Public Works Department, Nigeria, 1905. If you opt for the chamber pot, you're treated to the distinct pleasure of having your most private moment accompanied by the sensation of being watched by whatever wildlife has infiltrated your room. The darkness transforms every shadow into a potential threat, and that's not entirely paranoia. Snakes were regularly found in colonial housing, with one missionary in Tanganyika reporting removing 16 snakes from his home over a 6-month period, 5 of which were venomous. Missionary Society records, Lutheran Mission, German East Africa, 1904. For female colonials, the nighttime experience included additional challenges. Monthly menstruation without modern products or sanitary facilities was a logistical nightmare rarely discussed in official correspondence, but frequently mentioned in private letters home. One administrator's wife in Nyasaland described it as a monthly hell within the greater hell of colonial life. Personal correspondence, Elizabeth Cartwright, British Central Africa, 1903. If you're fortunate enough to fall back asleep after your nighttime adventures, you'll soon be awakened by pre-dawn wildlife, roosters, birds, monkeys, and an assortment of creatures seemingly determined to announce the coming day at the earliest possible moment. Many colonial officials reported shifting their sleep schedules to rise at 4:30 or 5:00 a.m., simply because sleep became impossible after that point. Administrative scheduling records, various colonies, 1900到1905. As you lie awake in the pre-dawn darkness, scratching at fresh insect bites that somehow materialized despite your careful netting arrangement, you might contemplate the life choices that brought you to this sweaty, itchy, sleep-deprived state. The romanticism of civilizing the dark continent seems considerably less appealing when you're picking bugs out of your hair and wondering if that rash is just heat-related or the first sign of some exotic tropical disease. But don't worry, dawn is approaching, bringing with it a whole new cycle of colonial miseries for you to endure. Assuming, of course, that you survived the night without dying of malaria, snakebite, scorpion sting, or the pure existential dread of realizing you still have years left on your colonial posting. Rise and shine, colonial servant. Another glorious day in the empire awaits. Congratulations on surviving the night. Unfortunately, your streak of continued existence is now threatened by the most dangerous aspect of colonial life, the medical care. Let's explore what happens when your body inevitably succumbs to one of the 1,000 potential ailments lurking in 1900s Africa. That persistent headache and general feeling of awfulness you've been ignoring for days? Could be malaria, typhoid, yellow fever, sleeping sickness, or just the standard colonial combination of heat exhaustion, dehydration, and existential dread. Time to visit the colonial doctor, assuming one exists within 100 miles of your posting. Medical coverage in colonial Africa was astoundingly sparse, with typical ratios of 1 European doctor per 100, 200, 0 population in most colonies. Colonial Medical Service records, various administrations, 1,000, 900, 1,910. The journey to the nearest medical facility might be an adventure in itself. Hours or days of travel over poor roads, exposing your already weakened body to further environmental assaults. Colonial hospitals were generally clustered around administrative centers, leaving vast territories with no formal medical coverage. In German East Africa, 75% of European outposts were more than a day's journey from the nearest hospital. Colonial Health Service distribution maps, German Imperial Archives, 1902. If you're lucky enough to reach a colonial hospital, prepare to be underwhelmed. The typical facility is understaffed, under-equipped, and fundamentally unprepared for the range of tropical diseases it's meant to treat. Medical training in Europe did little to prepare doctors for African conditions, a fact reflected in the grim mortality statistics of colonial hospitals. Patient mortality rates in colonial hospitals averaged 15–20%, compared to 7–9% in equivalent European facilities. Comparative Hospital Statistics, British Colonial Office, 1903. The hospital building itself is likely a modified European design, poorly adapted to tropical conditions. Wards are overcrowded, ventilation is inadequate, and sanitation is conceptual at best. Cross-infection was so common that colonial medical reports frequently mentioned patients contracting new diseases during their hospital stays. One French medical officer in Senegal estimated that 30% of his patients developed secondary infections while under treatment. Inspection reports, French Colonial Health Service, 1904. Your doctor, assuming you're important enough to warrant the attention of an actual European physician rather than a medical assistant, is probably overworked, undertrained in tropical medicine, and quite possibly self-medicating with alcohol or opium derivatives. Colonial medical services struggled with staffing problems throughout the colonial period, with one British report noting that many colonial doctors were those who could not secure desirable positions at home. Internal assessment, Colonial Medical Service recruitment, British Colonial Office, 1902. The diagnostic process is a masterclass in medical guesswork. Without modern laboratory tests, doctors relied heavily on observable symptoms, many of which were common across multiple serious diseases. That fever, headache, and fatigue could indicate malaria, typhoid, yellow fever, or any number of other tropical ailments. Misdiagnosis rates were estimated between 30–40% for complex cases. Retrospective analysis, Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, 1909. Treatment options are limited, brutal, and often as dangerous as the diseases themselves. Bloodletting, yes, actual bloodletting with leeches or lancets, remained a common treatment for fevers in colonial medicine well into the early 1900s. Mercury compounds were still prescribed for various conditions despite their toxicity. Arsenic derivatives were used against parasitic infections, with dosages determined by little more than educated guesswork. Colonial medical records show that iatrogenic deaths, those caused by medical treatment, accounted for approximately 15% of European mortality in colonial hospitals. Cause of death statistics, combined colonial records, 1900, 1908. Quinine is the miracle drug of the era, the only effective treatment for malaria, but it comes with its own spectacular side effects. Tinnitus, vertigo, nausea, and visual disturbances are common even at standard dosages. Prolonged use, which was necessary in endemic areas, could cause a condition called synchronism, resulting in permanent hearing damage and neurological effects. Colonial medical records show that up to 10% of long-term European residents experience significant quinine toxicity. Pharmaceutical complication reports, various colonial medical services, 1900到1910. Surgical procedures, should you require them, are performed with a combination of outdated techniques, limited anesthesia, and questionable sterilization practices. Surgical mortality rates in colonial hospitals hovered around 25–30% for major procedures, roughly triple the rates in contemporary European hospitals. Surgical outcome statistics, British Colonial Medical Service, 1904–1908. Infections were so common post-surgery that they were considered an expected outcome rather than a complication. For tropical diseases with no effective treatments, the medical approach was primarily palliative, meaning they'd try to keep you comfortable while your body either fought off the disease or succumbed to it. Recovery was often attributed to a strong constitution rather than any particular medical intervention. Colonial medical reports frequently described patients who recovered as having exceptional fortitude or being naturally resistant, medical terminology for We have no idea why they didn't die. Patient outcome reports. Various colonial hospitals, 1,901,910. The pharmacy stocks are limited, often expired, and potentially contaminated. Medications requiring refrigeration were particularly problematic in tropical climates before reliable cooling technology. Many drugs degraded rapidly in heat and humidity, losing potency or developing toxic byproducts. Pharmaceutical supply chains were notoriously unreliable, with shipments often delayed by months. One colonial doctor in Nigeria reported receiving a supply of urgently needed medications nearly 6 months after ordering them, by which time several patients had died. Supply chain records, Colonial Medical Depot, Lagos, 1,903. Local medical knowledge and traditional remedies, some of which were genuinely effective, were largely dismissed by European physicians as native superstition. This, despite the fact that several effective treatments, including quinine itself, were originally derived from indigenous medical practices. Colonial medical records show minimal integration of local medical knowledge into formal colonial healthcare until much later in the colonial period. Ethnobotanical studies, Royal Botanical Gardens archives, 1910到1920. If your condition is deemed serious enough, you might be evacuated back to Europe, a journey that could take weeks or months depending on your location and transportation options. Many didn't survive the trip. Ships carrying invalid colonials back to Europe were grimly nicknamed ghost ships due to the number of passengers who died en route. Records from the Elder Dempster shipping line, which operated between West Africa and Britain, show that approximately 5% of medical evacuees died during the voyage home. Passenger manifests and medical records. Elder Dempster Line, 1,910. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of colonial medical care was the isolation. Serious illness meant separation from whatever social connections you'd established, often without reliable means of communication. Colonial hospital records include numerous references to patients who deteriorated rapidly after being denied visitor access, suggesting that social isolation contributed significantly to poor outcomes. Patient observation notes, various colonial hospitals, 1,907. For those who survived a serious illness, recovery was often prolonged and incomplete. What modern medicine would recognize as post-viral syndromes or chronic conditions were dismissed as tropical neurasthenia or weak constitution. Many colonial officials who survived serious tropical diseases reported persistent symptoms for years afterward, with some never fully recovering their previous health. Long-term follow-up studies, colonial pension records, 1910到1920. So there you have it, the colonial medical experience in all its primitive, inadequate glory. If the diseases don't kill you, the treatments might. If the treatments don't kill you, the hospital conditions probably will. And if by some miracle you survive all three, you'll likely spend the rest of your colonial service with recurring health problems that nobody can properly diagnose or treat. Still think colonial adventure sounds romantic? Perhaps it's time to reconsider your career choices, assuming, of course, that you're still alive to make any choices at all. So, you've survived our little 24-hour tour of colonial Africa circa 1900. Congratulations! That puts you ahead of roughly 30% of actual European colonials who didn't make it through their first year. The mortality rates among colonial administrators, missionaries, and commercial agents during their first 12 months in Africa regularly exceeded 25% in many territories. Colonial service personnel records, combined European colonial archives, 1,895-1,910. As you return to your comfortable 21st century existence, complete with air conditioning, antibiotics, and a disturbing lack of things trying to actively murder you through your own digestive system, perhaps take a moment to reflect on the colonial enterprise that brought thousands of woefully unprepared Europeans to the African continent. They came seeking glory, adventure, profit, and the chance to civilize people who were, in many practical ways, significantly better adapted to their environment than the Europeans could ever hope to be. The colonial project wasn't just a moral catastrophe for the subjected peoples of Africa, though it absolutely was that. It was also a monument to European arrogance, a stubborn refusal to adapt to environmental realities, and a masterclass in how not to live in a tropical climate. While local populations had spent generations developing appropriate housing, clothing, food systems, and medical knowledge, Europeans insisted on recreating little pockets of London, Paris, or Berlin, in environments fundamentally hostile to such transplantation. Your modern discomforts, a delayed flight, a slow internet connection, that coffee that's just slightly too cold, would register as unimaginable luxuries to the sweating, dysenteric colonial administrator trying to file paperwork while hallucinating from quinine toxicity and picking lice out of his slowly rotting woolen suit. So next time you complain about your office being too warm, remember it's probably not 110°F with 90% humidity and a breeding population of malarial mosquitoes circling your head. When your stomach feels a bit off after some questionable takeout, be grateful it's not full-blown cholera from drinking water that was basically a microbial party bus. And when you slide into your clean, bug-free bed tonight, say a little prayer of thanks that you're not listening for the telltale scuttling of scorpions across your floor. The past is not just another country, it's a nightmare realm where everything, from the air you breathe to the ground you walk on, is conspiring to end your existence in the most unpleasant way possible. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson from our little historical excursion. Progress isn't just about technology or medicine. It's about all the countless ways we've managed to make the world slightly less actively homicidal. Now go hug your flush toilet. It's doing more to keep you alive than any colonial doctor ever could.